French President Emmanuel Macron's latest visits to Cameroon, Benin and Guinea Bissau aim to redefine relations with its former West African colonies, according to French presidential officials. But redefining in what way? Analysts see Macron's visit as a continuation of what's called Françafrique, the post-colonial doctrine that dictates the terms of governance, a doctrine that Macron says he wants to break away from. Welcome to the program. I'm Hazem Sika. Well, Emmanuel Macron is not the only European leader to visit Africa. Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov visited Egypt and Ethiopia last month as well. The continent is being diplomatically courted by both sides in the Russia-Ukraine conflict, as it has largely refused to join Western condemnation and sanctions towards Russia. But the French connection in West Africa far outweighs Russia's new economic and military ties with the region, as the French language CFA franc currency remains in place for many of the former colonial states, as well as French troops and business. With France, the United States, China and Russia seeking to increase their influence in Africa, is the continent the center of a new Cold War? Well, joining us now to discuss this in Saint-Jean-de-Luz, France, Emmanuel Dupuy, President of the Institute for European Perspective and Security. In Dakar, Chris Ogunmodede, Associate Editor of the World Politic Review. In London, Paul Melly, Consulting Fellow with the Africa Programme at Chatham House. And also in Dakar, Olewole Ojewale, Central Africa Analyst at the Institute for Security Studies. Good to have you all with us, gentlemen. So, Emmanuel, if I could start with you, what do you read into the French president's recent visit to West Africa?
Well, there was a lot of ambition for this trip. This was his first foreign trip after his re-election. Every president wants to go to Africa. Emmanuel Macron decided to go to Africa very rapidly after his first election, going in Mali, in Niger, and in Burkina Faso, giving the occasion of giving the impression that he wanted to rewrite Franco-Africa story with the Ouagadougou speech in November 2017. More or less, nothing, at least, has been achieved during this first mandate. And this second mandate is opening with sort of evidence that the president did not want to fulfill during his first mandate, going in countries where the obvious need for reconstruction of the relations was a reality, and therefore the choice of Cameroon, the choice of Benin, and the choice of Guinea Bissau was a bit a surprise for some, or at least for the first step going to Cameroon, because calling for democracy in a country where the president has been elected in November 1982, achieving his seventh mandate, maybe going to an eighth mandate in 2025, or at least pushing his son, Franck Biya, to go to election is not really in accordance with the will to rewrite the story between France and the continent.
Chris Ogunmodede, what do you see from this visit, and what do you think are France's intentions here?
He wanted to demonstrate that his plans to restructure, quote unquote, Africa's relationship with France is still a thing, you know? The first term was largely unsuccessful as far as that's concerned, despite the speech in Ouagadougou and other elements of the restructured Franco-Africa summit and things like that. Those have not really gone well as far as substance, you know, it's a lot of form. So Macron essentially wants to demonstrate that he wants to do that. But as I wrote in my newsletter last week, a lot of West Africans aren't buying it because they look at, as I say, the substance. You know, they look at, for example, the fact that France has yet to demonstrate sincerity as far as its commercial relationships, its political relationships, the security partnerships, the CFA franc currency is very much a driver of antipathy, and that's essentially France has done nothing as far as reforming or abolishing that currency. So for a lot of West Africans, not just in Cameroon, in Benin and Guinea-Bissau, but elsewhere in Senegal, in Mali, in Guinea, other places, they just look and see this is much of the same. It's just a lot of, rhetoric.
Olewole, what's your take on this, and what do you read into the timing of this visit as well?
Thank you so much. By virtue of recent development on the continent, particularly within the West African sub-region, the incident in Mali, Burkina Faso, and then even the admission of Togo into the Commonwealth of Nations, what is actually clear on the front burner is that the relationship that France has maintained with Francophone West African country is in a serious disrepair. And I think what Macron is trying to do, like other previous speakers have said, is to see the possibility of rebuilding that. But I see France in a very dire situation here, in the sense that in terms of the legitimacy of support, the trust that the Francophone West African citizens have reposed in France over the year is at the lowest ebb in the recent time, in terms of the support for democratic governance, in terms of military support, and a whole of gamut of issues. I think in terms of the relationship that the citizens are willing to commit to the French government to sustaining the relationship forward is at the lowest ebb now. And I see Macron jumping into the water to see how he can maybe do some strategic repositioning to bring that relationship back.
Paul Melly, a lot of skepticism about this visit by the French president. A lot of people seeing this as just a kind of neo-colonialism repackaged.
Well, I think we shouldn't underestimate the difficulty of the challenge that he faces in terms of diffusing the mistrust that had built up over many decades, not really just over his presidency, but many, many decades before. And one thing that interestingly illustrates this is that during Macron's first term, the French development budget for Africa has been hugely increased, particularly for the low-income countries, particularly in the Sahel. His government has passed a new development policy law through the French Parliament, which set out 19 priority countries, and I think 18 of them are African. Only one is outside Africa, and the development effort has been really serious. And by contrast, the UK has practically abolished most of its long-term direct development aid to African countries. The bilateral aid budgets of UK bilateral aid budgets for development in African countries, not emergency humanitarian support, but long-term development, have been cut by between 60 and 90% per country. And yet the UK has made this huge cut almost without criticism. And it's passed almost unnoticed. There are private complaints among policymakers and diplomats, but in the public space, among the African public, this huge sort of setback in British engagement for Africa has passed unnoticed, whereas the French are struggling with this hugely contentious situation. And another thing that illustrates it is the perception when he tries to act, if he does nothing, he's accused of doing nothing. When he acts, he's accused of interfering. And we can see this in the case of Cameroon. A couple of years ago, a Cameroon human rights activist stopped Macron when he was visiting a public event in Paris and said, so what are you doing about the human rights that are going on in Cameroon and the government's deployment of troops in Anglophone regions of the country? And he said, well, I've been onto the phone to President Biya. I've been telling him, you've got to, respect people, you've got to listen to human rights, etc. And after he made that remark in public, Macron was criticized for interfering and for arrogance. And then when he went to Cameroon last week, people complained that he hadn't talked about human rights in public. So I'm not saying that he's got everything right, but it just highlights the extraordinary difficulty of rebuilding this relationship. And yet he keeps trying, because his personal view is that the relationship between Europe and Africa has to be one of the most important for any European country, and particularly for France, but more generally for the EU as a whole. The relationship with the continent that is next door, that is its nearest neighbor, has to be an absolutely pivotal priority. When his new Prime Minister, Elisabeth Borne, talked to the French Parliament, made her general policy speech 2 or 3 weeks back, literally the only other part of the world that she mentioned in the entire speech outside Europe was Africa. And the need, and she said the need to continue to renew that relationship in partnership and dialogue and working on, she used the word, the work of memory, which in effect means facing up to the things that went in the past. It's a really difficult task he faces.
We're going to play a clip now of Macron criticizing the Russian presence in Africa during his visit to Cameroon.
Cette présence russe hybride qui passe par la désinformation, par
This
les
hybrid
milices,
Russian
par
presence, which involves
nouvelles
misinformation, militars, new forms of what I have trouble qualifying as cooperation, but complicity with weakened powers or completely illegitimate ones when it comes to military juntas. It is a preoccupation. First of all, every country has the freedom to have diplomatic ties and defend the interests of their people. That's the basic principle of what we're all doing for ourselves, so that this format of Russian influence does not spread too much, because I do not think it is a good thing, especially think it is not good for the people.
les uns et les autres pour nous-mêmes, mais à ce que ce schéma ne se diffuse pas trop, parce que je ne pense pas qu'il soit bon.
So, Chris Ogunmodede, the French president there, essentially saying, don't trust the Russians, they're not looking out for your interests, but we are. What do you say to that?
Well, that's a very common tactic by the French, by Macron, but the French government officials in general, and Western government officials in general, who blame a lot of what they call the anti-French sentiment on, quote, Russian disinformation campaigns, and, you know, a lot of what they regard as Russian efforts to sow doubts in the minds of Africans that, you know, France and, you know, the West in general are have the best interest of Africans at the top of their agenda. But to that, what I often say, Africans don't need the Russians to tell them what France is doing, good or bad. Like, they have history to, you know, determine that. And when French officials refer the so-called Russian disinformation as the explanation for, quote, anti-French sentiment, it's frankly disingenuous when they do that, because it obscures, for one thing, Africans' agency and their ability to decipher what's happening as far as their international relationships. And also it ignores the fact that when you look in, you know, comparative terms, the Russian relationship with African countries in comparison to what I call the big three of China, the European Union, and the United States, it's, you know, we're talking, it's very minuscule, you know, two-way Russia-Africa trade is 20 billion, you know, in comparison with China, it's 200 billion, you know, it's just not, we're not talking the same thing here. So when Macron constantly refers to the Russians and, you know, Russian disinformation and Wagner and all of these, that's an attempt to, you know, deflect from from France's own failures on the political front, on the diplomatic front, as well as the historical. You know, Macron and other French presidents talk a lot about, you know, severing ties with the past and a new relationship with Africa. But as far as I said, the substance of actually being accountable and transparent about the past, for example, with the Cameroonian independence movement, they obscure, they deflect, and they refuse to accept responsibility for things that Paris did. So when Africans hear Russia as, you know, a bait and switch, they're not interested, they're not buying it.
Emmanuel Dupuy, what's your take on this, as far as, in particular, this accusation that he's simply trying to counter the recent Russian moves in the region, and this might be seen perhaps as kind of a panic move?
Well, it is. I have to say, obviously, this is the reality. Emmanuel Macron dashed to Cameroon when he understood that there was pressure put on Cameroon, as well as Benin, that was mentioned before. Gabon and Togo have joined the Commonwealth the 25th of June. Much thought and much are still thinking that President of Benin, Patrice Talon, would be doing the same thing. So there is a huge amount of pressure in the countries which we used to call Pays du Champ, the 18 former colonies that we have. Emmanuel Macron, in his 3 speeches in Bissau, in Cotonou, and in Yaoundé, took a lot of time, obviously too much time, to put pressure on the disinformation movement, to speak about Russia Today, to speak about Sputnik, to speak about Wagner. A lot of its African counterparts are integrating his fascination about that. And again, there's a bit of a panic movement. But again, it is very important to say that this reality that President Macron is facing is not only the fault of Macron, it is a continuation of a lack of interest, a lack of mobilization, a certain blur on certain realities. The restitution process, of course, has been going very well with the restitution of the 28 artifacts which France took in 1892 in Abomey Palace in Benin. But of course, this must not forget that 70,000 of these artifacts are still in the Quai Branly Museum in France. So there's a lot to be done. It's a starting point. Emmanuel Macron is understanding that he has not put a lot of interest in Western African countries besides the ones that were engaged in the terrorist agenda. This was his first mandate agenda. This is why he put a lot of pressure to build and to accompany the G5 movement with the post-summit and the creation of the G5 in 2014 under the authority of his predecessor. But again, there's a bit of a sort of fascination and too much dedication to counter or to contain Russian integration or Russian perspective on the continent, when 21 African countries have now signed security agreements with Russia.
I'm glad you mentioned the artifacts, because we're going to talk a little bit more about that now. We're going to play another clip of the French president addressing that, saying that he wants to simplify and carry on the return of plundered historical treasures to Benin during a joint press conference with his Beninese counterpart, Patrice Talon, in Cotonou.
Nous avons dû voter une loi, compte tenu des règles françaises, qui protègent les œuvres d'art et qui ont historiquement été faites pour éviter que
We had to pass a law taking into account French rules protecting artworks, and which have historically been created to prevent such and such from taking artworks out of the national territory. What we want to do now is to be able to simplify the framework of these restitutions on that basis. A report was requested from Mr. Martinez, the former president of the Louvre. It has been submitted and clarifies a series of criteria, so we are technically, if I may say so, scientifically ready. Now the minister will submit a draft text to me, and it will be presented before the French Parliament for us to have this framework in parallel. I hope our scientists and curators can continue their work.
nos scientifiques, nos conservateurs puissent continuer le travail.
So, Olewale, if I can turn back to you on this, given previous criticism and skepticism about France's intentions to West African countries, this issue of artifacts and taking them back to their original lands, is this not a step in the right direction?
Yes, it's always a step in the right direction, because rebuilding the relationship also implies that France and other Western powers that are culpable in this regard are ready to right the wrongs of the past, because you can't really move forward to the extent to which people are tied to the chain of the pains that the colonialism has brought to them, particularly when you look at the plundering of artifacts. Don't forget that the artifacts that were pillaged from here is what people go to see in some of those international museums and pay huge amount of money that is generating revenue to those Western countries. So I think this is in the right direction, but the real question that I'm going to ask here is that why is it always taking forever before we see the move in this direction? It's always a continuous rhetoric whenever, and I'm not singling out Macron alone in this regard. Like I said, some of the Western powers that are culpable in this regard, it is when they come to the continent that it becomes part of the speech that they are going to deliver. But the moment they return back to their cocoons in Europe, you probably do not hear anything from it for probably for the next 12 months or thereabout before you begin to maybe see any sign that they are really committed to the repatriation. So I would take this with a pinch of salt, because like it has been highlighted earlier by Dopre, that thousands of such artifacts are still in museums. So it is just a trickle of it that we are hearing that they want to repatriate back to Africa. So it is it behoves the government of Benin to do everything possible within their home part to ensure that the process is not dragging. But I usually take this with a pinch of salt, because almost all countries in West Africa are affected by this, whether you talk about artifacts of Nigerian artifacts that are in Germany, in UK, and other destinations in Europe, or you talk about Ghana, you talk about Liberia, Sierra Leone. All of these countries have their artifacts trapped in those places. So, in fact, as a civil society activist, I would say it is not only the artifacts that should be repatriated back to the country. They should find a way to monetize the proceeds that they have generated from those artifacts that are lying in their museum over the years, and not only return the artifacts to the countries alone, but to also monetize the proceeds that will be coming to Africa. So, like the trip on the part of Macron this time around, I think it's a panic button that has been pressed, and he's trying to see how he can go through all these and rebuild the relationship. But there is a lot on the table to unpack for Macron, and it is not just to come to Africa once in a while and think he can probably do all those in one sweep. There's really a lot of diplomatic process. There's a lot of negotiation that needs to take place. And if it's about rebuilding the relationship, a lot of things need to be touched.
Paul Melly, one visit isn't going to suddenly fix everything, is it? And given the sentiment in many of these West African nations right now towards France and its intentions, I know you mentioned that Emmanuel Macron is making an effort in this area, but it seems he's really up against it, certainly in terms of public opinion in many of these countries about how they see France.
I think he is. I think it's an unfair criticism to suggest that this is a sort of one-off quick trip or a last-minute panic gesture. I mean, the whole process of returning the artifacts, it's several years ago that he set up a commission, appointed a Senegalese and a French historian to look at the whole question of artifacts and write a report with their recommendations as to what should be done about it. And he's also gone through this work of memory, of looking at past wrongs. He went, as we know, he made a highly publicized trip to Rwanda last year after an independent commission had looked at the French behavior in Rwanda during the run-up to the genocide and its aftermath. And effectively, he made the entire report public and acknowledged all the things that had gone wrong. Similarly, there's been an independent report on what happened during the War of Independence in Algeria, when again the French were accused of atrocities. So I think you can say, on looking at the significance of recognizing past historical wrongs, whether it's human rights abuses and massacres or whether it's the theft of artifacts, he's actually probably been ahead of most other Western leaders. Again, the UK hasn't done anything about it, nor has the UK really done anything, for example, about what happened, the awful human rights abuses that were committed by some of the British military during the run-up to Kenya's independence. So, but he still faces an enormous task because of the depth of mistrust and a perception that France is often rather arrogant and that it presumes to speak for people and say what Africans think, when of course if a French person is saying what African thinks, that comes across as arrogant. And a further component is the fact that what France has worked very hard on cultivating good relationships with African leaders, including many of those who've been elected. But there is also a growing disenchantment, particularly among urban youth in West Africa, with their leaders. He has tried to develop youth initiatives, but these things are still very much at what you might call a small symbolic level. How to overcome that distrust, and particularly the deep, deep distrust among urban West African youth, that's a really difficult context in which to unscramble this.
All right, that is going to have to be the last word. Our thanks to Emmanuel Dupuy, who had to leave us just a moment ago, but we thank him for his time, and thank you as well to Paul Melly, Chris Ogunmodede, and Olewale Ojiwale. Thanks very much for being with us. And remember, you can see more discussion and debate on our YouTube channel. Search for Roundtable TRT World. But for now, from me and all the team here, goodbye, and thanks for watching.